I am unashamed. What about you?
So, it's the last week of duck season?
The last week, we're going into the last
The
week.
last week of
I'm
duck
going to miss the last week of duck season.
season. Yeah, 'cause
Maybe
you
not.
got to film.
I'm filming. We're actually doing podcast tomorrow, so I'll get to go hunting a couple of hours before that. So that'll be my last day. It's kind of sad.
We're actually about 200 more this year than last year. The numbers are up.
Phil and those numbers, he's looking. Well, last year was one of the worst seasons that we've ever had, though.
Yep.
So it's not that this year's been that great. It's just
We were markedly better this year.
I've got a camera guy coming in this week. Do y'all know that? To get some footage of ducks flying and ducks falling.
well, I hate I'm going to miss it.
The ducks,
I don't.
ducks falling, maybe.
I will give this for all our longtime listeners and people that have followed us back when we were doing the Duck Men videos and trying to capture the elusive duck on camera. It's very hard to do. I've seen some of the best cameramen in the world who came down and thought they were, just because they were good cameramen, they thought they were going to be able to film ducks. Didn't happen. They were humbled.
Yep.
Ducks are real unpredictable, and the problem I have with them is that when you're trying to convince ducks that are from Canada that these painted pieces of plastic called decoys are real, it's very difficult to do that.
What's the guy that got up high in the trees and went to work back in Arkansas, and he was around there for about a decade?
Talking about Lyle?
Lyle. We got,
How can you forget Lyle's name? Lyle.
well, because they're getting old.
Yeah.
Lyle, you talked about people who were good at it. I think overall, Lyle got the best footage.
He was
He was
fantastic.
the best one. That's what I should have done is got Lyle to come in because you're making me nervous, Jase, because I'm flying a guy in from LA. This is for the movie. It's because there's the scenes in the duck blind where the movie looks great except for the ducks. I'm like, we don't have good footage.
Well, he's going to be humbled. He's going to be humbled.
So we'll see what happens.
Here's what you do. I'll give you some advice. We didn't have plans to do this, but if you want to film ducks, I'm going to give you the key to filming ducks.
The Key to Filming Ducks by Jase Robertson.
30 years of being in the industry of filming ducks. If you're a camera operator, here is the key. Not top 10, there's one thing. You go from the hunter to the ducks. They will always lead you to the ducks. Because if you're trying to follow the ducks on the camera, they're never experienced enough unless they were a duck hunter, which Lyle was. But Lyle said, when in doubt, he always looked at the hunters. And wherever their eyes went, that it just took him.
Which, by the way,
ducks.
you just touched on the key.
That's good
If
advice.
you were ever hunting in the blind with the duck men, so because I never wanted to flare ducks, I never looked at the ducks. I looked at the ends of the blind, the guys who were calling the ducks, to know when things were going to be happening. So I never looked here. I looked here. So I knew exactly what was happening by watching Jase or watching Dad because y'all were watching them.
So the two guys on the
I only
end.
bring Lyle Sinky up because
He's probably one of the best we ever had.
I sit down in my chair on a Wednesday night, and I think one of y'all had given a lesson.
I had spoken. I remember this like it was yesterday.
Somebody
I
was-
spoke out of John 15. We were going through John on Wednesday night class. I did a
But here's this cameraman, and kind of a lot of fix-it types. He was there, but anyway, afterwards we drove back to my house. I sat down in my chair, and he walks by me in front of me in my living room, and he lies down on the floor.
he collapsed.
So I got the TV on there, and I'm looking down at Lyle, and he got his head's like this, and he's just lying there. So I turned the TV down, and I said, Sinky,
Which is nice of you to do that.
he's lying on my floor. I said, something is up here. I said, what about it? Well, he went through his drug use, among others, sins, and he says, I'm not getting anywhere.
He gave his life story, and it
He
wasn't
said,
good.
this is pitiful.
Yep.
And he gave me his life story, and I'm sitting there listening to him. I said, well, you want to come to Jesus and get it over with? be forgiven, guaranteed you can be raised from the dead. He said, that's what I want. He said, and he asked a few questions, I spent about an hour with him. He never looked up. He just had his head down on the floor and had on his arm like that. He was talking. He came out of that. So he did become a child of God.
Yep.
Through it all.
He did.
No, he did. He's an interesting fella, and his conversion was a complete transformation.
Yep.
It was awesome. Got his family back together.
Like Jase and I, he went through a biblical training. Although, like us, well, like you, I guess I did.
This is after.
After he never really did official work for a church much, but he had he did that Bible base kind of like we did.
Oh yeah, you need it.
Division.
This sermon I actually preached. It's so weird that I remember that. Of all the things I can't remember, I do remember that because he worked for us for years before this happened.
Yep.
And we knew he had some problems, but and to Phil's credit more than anybody else, he was just patient with him. And you can imagine all the gospel presentations he heard, and he just had to work through it all. But the actual sermon, because I remember it, was the quote that Jesus made in John 15:25, where it says, "They hated me without reason." And the previous verses, says, if you belong to the world, this is in verse 19, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. And so that was kind of the gist of it, which is it's clear you're either in the world.
He knew we loved him.
You're either in the world, and that's what you're all about, or you're in Jesus, and the world hates you and doesn't understand you. And I think somewhere in his life, he had heard Jesus many times in many duck blind situations, and he had actually come to church with us quite a few times. But for some reason, I guess the line was drawn in that sermon, because really that's what it is. It is a depiction on, are you worldly or are you in Jesus? There's no middle ground. You're not on the fence. You're not checking it out. Jesus is not a compartment. You're either all in or you're all out. That was basically the gist. And somewhere in there, it hit him. He's like, you know what? What am I doing here? And it was very moving for all of us to see him change.
So I've got a duck hunting question, because I haven't hunted this year, but at the beginning of the year, we talked about a new hole, the Ring of Fire, which was a vision of a prairie hole that Dad had seen up in the river bottoms.
Al, let me just interject before you go on. Now, we ended the last podcast with an argument, and you're fixing to head down another argument.
Oh, excellent! I love when I swerve into a good argument.
Non-biblical argument.
Well, we went 18 minutes in the overtime, which is we were scheduled for 15, but Jase is so argumentative that he took us literally an extra 3 or 4 minutes.
By the way,
here's why I did that.
Those of you who hadn't crossed over to overtime, if you want to catch a great argument, you might want to.
We made the hole. We never hunted it. We decided to hunt it. There was a lot of wood ducks in there, but we said, well, maybe a few big ducks too. So we had a little thing I call the Ring of Fire inside the hole. It's about 30 acres of just left the big trees, and the grass grew up after we cleared it up. Had a logger do it for me. I gave him blowdowns from a hurricane. He had enough wood where he didn't have to pay for it.
Phil's explaining this.
Everything got happy. So we tried it, and 4 of us went. We did kill full limits of woodies.
You were past shooting them. The argument was,
we hadn't been back since.
When they made the hole, my thought was, and I can't keep my mouth shut, so they cleared out this whatever it is, 10-acre spot?
30 acres.
30-acre spot. And in the middle, they had a ring of trees.
Right, the ring.
They had a hole in the middle of the ring. So you basically think a donut with an island of trees.
Yep.
And then another mini donut with a hole. And I was shocked when I pulled up the first time, because when they put the blind in, I thought they were going to put the blind facing toward the donut, not inside the hole. I thought, but they had it faced inside the Ring of Fire. You see what I mean? I thought the ring of fire was the hole, the
big
opening, the big. So you just move your blind around the island facing outward. But when it was faced inward, I thought, I don't like this.
Yeah, what we found was the blind inside the ring of fire. We did get about 4 or 5 out of several hundred that had the opportunity to come in there. About 4 or 5 came down in the ring of fire, and we shot them.
Which was the idea.
But they lit on the outside, which is what I was. I'm not trying to say I was right.
Yeah,
I was just,
our ducks came from wood ducks flying over our head, going anywhere but there. So they just come over low. We'd shoot them. But
I mean, to
they
be
moved
fair,
the blind. I hadn't tried it yet, but I'm gonna try it and just see what that'll do.
To be fair, I didn't mind Phil trying it. I mean, I thought
because how do you know?
He may be right, but I feel like that's asking a lot for him to get down inside this.
So the reason I brought it up, not knowing any of this debate that went on about where to put a blind, was 2 things. One is because I loved the last episode. By the way, those of you that are subscribed to Blaze TV, you get In the Woods with Phil, which is Dad's show that was on before we started doing the podcast. In the last episode of In the Woods with Phil, we filmed it in that spot, Dad. That was our last episode.
Oh, is that right?
That was right. And we talked about this vision you had for this hole. But I liked it because it took me back, and Jase, you can remember it too, and Jase was very young, of where we hunted when we were super young. When we moved down here, we made a transition. But for the first couple of years, we went back up there. And so I thought about it, the journey that people take for something that's beautiful. So we would get up here at about 2:30 in the morning, and we would get in your truck or a car and drive all the way back up, almost a 2-hour drive north. Then we would get in Jeeps and Broncos and all this and go another, I don't know how long, 30, 45 minutes through mud and all that, and then get in boats and go out to this big cypress tree, and then we would hunt. Yep. Of course, you had to get there, before daylight, decoys, all that. So it was this beautiful place that we hunted, and I still remember all that, and you kind of tried to transport some of that idea here.
That's right.
Which I thought was a beautiful thing in the idea of it. It's just why I like it.
It was a perfect idea because a hurricane ravaged the woods that we had just bought, so we were all like disappointed because it was so beautiful before. But then we took a dozer, got some loggers down there, cleaned it up, then made this meadow of grass amongst these big trees and this little island of trees.
Oh, it's a picture.
Oh, it's it's a form of and symbolically, what happens to us, when we have this encounter with the Lord.
Which is what I thought, Jase. It was like a journey. The idea of a journey.
Hurricane, the mess up, how can this be fixed? And all of a sudden, a bulldozer and death, a burial and a resurrection, and you look up and it's something spectacular.
Which was kind of the idea when Zach and I first started this idea. We produced Dad's show In the Woods with Phil. It was how does a guy who's in the woods impact the world with the good news of Jesus? And that was kind of the pathway through which the show is, and it's a beautiful journey that takes place, and it was just kind of a great metaphor. So that's how we began and ended that series, which ultimately led us to this podcast, which is kind of cool. So I don't know anyway how I got into this bigger picture.
And the movie. I mean, and this movie is titled The Blind. So it's kind of interesting that the whole thing is kind of a story told through, duck hunting trip, and you just think about like how much of that is part of Phil's life. But I mean, how much discipleship? I'm just thinking how much discipleship has gone down on your property. I mean, it wasn't a planned thing. There wasn't a program that you developed.
That's right.
Or anything like that. It was just guys would come in, and it's kind of what this podcast really is. It's like, there's guys that will come in and sit for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they'll move on and go do something else. But that's what it was. And I remember when Jep and I came out of the life we were living in, that was our respite for a season, for a couple of years, that's what we did. And, for me, that was some of the most transformative years of my life. And it wasn't intentional. It was intentional, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a system. It was just being around people. You guys mentioned earlier, about, you said, follow the best cameraman follows the shooter. Or if he said, look at the hunter. And I thought of?
Yeah, the hunter takes you to the ducks.
I thought of that verse to fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. If you try to look at the whole outcome and you're like, I gotta figure out how to do it all, or even the Bible itself, like we were talking about that in the last episode. Let me read the Bible as kind of my blueprint. Well, then, man, you pick this thing up right here. I mean, look how thick that is. I mean, that's intimidating. And if you don't know it, it's very intimidating. But if you just say, just look at the hunter, and he'll point you where to go. Look at Jesus. Get around God's people. Just incubate in that. Just get around God's people. Get around Jesus.
Yep.
And it's amazing what can happen, even in the woods, in a duck blind, in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana.
To finish my point about that, because I think Lyle was instrumental. I'd never seen it before. A lot of times he would have that camera facing the cameraman when he didn't know where the ducks were. But when we all got up to shoot, he just went with us and then turned the camera. But it gave a unique perspective, because most of the hunting shows, they try to follow the ducks, which is very hard to do. The ducks come in, they shoot. Well, you don't have the hunters interacting with it. So what they do is they call them cutaways. Well, they fake it. Then they say, we all get up and act like you're going to shoot. But what Lyle did, by, I think, just being brilliant and being a cameraman, he just had it all in one motion. And, of course, now they all do that. But back in the day, he was the first guy I've seen do that. But that's why he got, I'd say, over 90% of the ducks, because when in doubt, he just went to the hunters. Because if anything's going to happen in that 2 or 3 second period that they're going up, well, you wind up there right where the ducks are.
Which was part of our early success, was because our camera work was so much better than most of the competition on getting duck footage, which is funny now. The other day we went through the tour. We were talking about they have a tour at Duck Commander headquarters, and you go through there, you see some of our old footage I was looking at the other day. I thought, man, that's pretty good stuff. I mean,
it's good.
We were all.
It's good, clean fun. You're in God's creation, which is ultimately, how I even got interested in following Jesus, just because everybody has different, veins that they go down. But just the outdoors to me has always been a place where I just see the power of God. Because when you're looking at all the details from whatever you're doing, as far as hunting and trapping and walking and looking and seeing life and all these various different forms, from mayflies to berries to, it just becomes too overwhelming not to acknowledge that there's some kind of intelligent design behind this, and then you're like, oh, he wrote a book. Oh, let me check that out. So, I mean, I think it's that, but it's also just, Zach, you mentioned about having discipleship. It's the perfect setting for people to hear Jesus, because they're trapped, really. I mean, they get in a boat, they go out there, you're surrounded by water. You can't leave.
Yeah, where are you going to go?
Yeah, well, you're stuck here. But you're looking at God's creation. It's something fun. There's usually an occurrence that happens every 2 or 3 days. I mean, just yesterday, it was only me, Phil, and the nurse practitioner, Chad. And so the water.
Old Burrow was there.
Well, yeah. So this is day 4 yesterday, when it's me, you, and Chad went to the privet hole.
Yep.
And so the water's so deep now, one of the blinds we hunt, you have to go by an Argo because we don't have a boat there. And so Phil and Chad can be comfortable. I ride in the Argo by myself most of the way on dry land. They ride a nice, comfortable rig because Argo has no windshield. It's just you're out, bugs flying in your face, whatever. So when we get to the hole, we consolidate and everybody gets in the Argo. And we got all our stuff. I mean, it's literally too much stuff and too many men to get out there, but this is what we're doing. And so we're talking about, do we have all the stuff? And there was something, Phil, do you want your seat? There was a conversation. No, we're good. We're good. Okay. You sure you don't want your seat? Yeah. Well, I take off. So I'm going, I must have went, I don't know how far, a few 100 yards. And I come up on right when we're entering the lake, a big deep hole. So I slowed down because I didn't want to just hit it hard. Well, when I slowed down, I just hear a voice saying, "Oh, hold up." And I realized that when we were discussing if we had all our stuff, Chad had bounced out of the Argo to get Phil's seat. But I took off. And I couldn't, he was like, oh, wait, but I couldn't hear him because the motor,
So we
now
got a man just running
He's
out
just running behind us wide open.
Trying to keep
And
up.
he said, I knew when you hit that hole, I was going to have one. And he's kind of a big guy. And he was huffing and puffing. And I'm telling you, we got so tickled. Because I thought, where else in the world can you have this happen, on accident and it be this funny?
He didn't holler out loud, so he was just running.
Well, I said, why didn't you holler louder? And he said, I was out of breath after the first 20 steps because he had his way. And I thought, if you could have filmed that, here we are on a dark road.
Well, the last time we heard his name, it wasn't he and Burley pulling the boat with it. You and Zach were in with the Shanes pulling y'all out. You talk about
What'd y'all kill? 15 ducks and one visitor.
one nurse practitioner. Well, I tell you what.
But I was just gonna say, you have those experiences that are just good, clean fun. It was bad for him because he was like, "Boy, I got to get in shape." He's talking about it all morning. He's like, "Boy, I am." I was like, "For a nurse practitioner, you need to get in better shape." I ain't never seen a man huffing and puffing so much.
Oh, you run through after a four-wheeler down through the woods. You huff and puff.
Well, it's just mud, and ruts, and it was
mud.
horrible.
Well, the beauty of it is that it is because when Jesus first taught Peter, it was the exact style he used because he got him in a boat where he couldn't get out. Remember, Peter's cleaning his nets. He said, "Hey, Peter, let me get in your boat here. Push out here. Let me preach to these people." So really, Jesus used the same style on Peter. So we're in 1 Peter. Is where we are, and we're kind of hitting a new text today in chapter 1, verse 13. But before we do, I want to hit the last part of this text because we just barely touched on it because it's kind of intriguing. We read 10 through 12 in the last podcast, which is kind of that idea about the gospel being present all the way across time, the prophets, and how that, the whole time the gospel was what was there. The Holy Spirit had been working. And I thought about Jase, John 1:1 talks about, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh. And then you've talked about that before in Genesis 1, where you saw the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, and God said, and there was that word, Jesus was there from the very beginning. But I thought this was an intriguing little statement he threw in there, that last statement, before we get to 13. He said, even angels long to look into these things. Which was pretty incredible because what he said was this salvation has been spread across human history where people knew things and they didn't always know what the prophecy meant. They knew in their time it meant something and then it meant something in the future. But he kind of gives you the idea that the heavenly realms didn't really know what all this meant. In other words, they saw it unfolding from their perch, but they didn't know what any of it meant. And it made me think about, I wanted to read this, Ephesians 3:10, the way Paul put this. He said his intent was that now, talking about in the present age, when Paul wrote this, through the church, so the establishment of the church, same time Peter's writing, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known. And that word, parakipto, the Greek phrase there for be made known, means to stoop over and look. So that God should be made known to those who are stooping over and looking, to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. But I just like that picture that in the heavenly realms, they're like stooping over to look at what's going on in our realm to figure out what in the world God is doing. When you think about that visual, that these are beings that I'm assuming are created to not die. We don't read about them dying, so I'm assuming they're created to survive,
I've said this before. I believe it's because this is the greatest love story ever in the history of the world.
Right.
And, you get the idea from seeing verses, remember where the story Jesus told about not understanding the resurrection with people trying to put what happens on this earth in the resurrection context about how many times you've been married and who's going to be your husband in heaven. And he basically, said we'll be like the angels where, people won't be given in marriage. But he, before that, he's like, well, you're ignorant of the scriptures and the power of God, so even that, they're limited. I mean, the angels are not God,
Right.
but they're interested in somehow these earthly beings becoming heavenly beings. I mean, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened.
Plus the concept of redemption, forgiveness. I mean, they don't know that, so they're just like, "What is this?"
You remember the last word was Malachi. Well, there was 400 years of waiting,
Right.
and these angelic type, the prophets and all, trying to find out the time and circumstance of which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. I mean, it was over their head. They just couldn't grasp it.
Right.
Think about it. The Savior of the world is coming, and promise go all the way back to Genesis, 6,000 years. All of a sudden, they said, what in the world are we even, we're writing stuff down that we don't know what.
And their back and forth interaction. Let's take another break. And I have commented before that, at every phase of when Jesus came here, at his birth, in the garden before his death, at the tomb, whenever he was resurrected, when he ascended, and every phase, and then he says when he comes back, every phase of there were angels present.
That's right.
At each phase of the gospel story. So it's kind of interesting.
It
that
was
interaction.
revealed to them that they were not serving themselves. Yeah, they were not. It was revealed to them they were not serving themselves, but you. When they spoke of the things that have been told you by those who preach the gospel to you. Mm-hmm. Everybody, that's that Jase's famous line. Jesus is coming. 5,000-6,000 years later, they're all running around saying, "What in the world? What's fixing 400 years? We ain't heard a word from God." All of a sudden, they said, "Look for Elijah." That's John the Baptist. Malachi. That's what he mentions that. Mm-hmm. But they say, "Well, maybe it's time." But it was revealed to them is to someone else. Those who have had the gospel preached to them. So here comes the gospel. So I'm glad Peter put that in there. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
I got that from Jim McGuigan, by the way. The Old Testament, Jesus is coming. Matthew through John, Jesus is here. And Acts, Revelation, Jesus is coming back. But it simplifies it to people that to Zach's point earlier, that feels overwhelmed by the Bible. It's like, I'm going to introduce a person to you who is the image of God. And let's just start here. Well, that's real easy for people to wrap their head around. I want to bring something up. I've spent a lot of time since I'm around little ones now, 2 grandkids now, under 2. And the little one, that we've been a part of from a fostering situation, the first year of his life. I want to bring this up. I've been spending a lot of time in Matthew 18. And I do because of that, and also because of this illustration about the new birth that we're going to, as we continue to read 1 Peter, it's going to keep coming up. And so I want to bring this up, Matthew 18:10, where people get the idea about having guardian angels for kids. There's no doubt that in Matthew 18, when they asked a question in verse 1, they said, the disciples came and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" I think it's a legitimate question. The disciples, obviously were shocked in Jesus' answer, because Jesus took a little child and had him stand among them. And look, when we teach this passage, we always go to the illustration that Jesus had, which is, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So we always use it about repentance, which rightfully so. I'm not arguing that. But I just wanted to make the point that there's a lot in here about little ones and being innocent and Jesus welcoming them. And then it says, "He who welcomes a little child," this is verse 5, "like this, in my name welcomes me." Well, look, for me, to take in a kid from just the world that we really viewed as God sending from heaven, this verse means a lot to me. You see my point? It's like I'm in this battle, of wanting to pour love and, and trying to get this family reconciled. Well, that means a lot to me. And then when it goes on to say, you know, if anyone causes him to stumble, it'd be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone hung around his neck. So I'm like, I'm protecting this child. I mean, I'm taking this serious. I'm realizing how much is on the line. But the reason I'm bringing this up, because when you get to verse 10, it says, see that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Now look, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I know that there's some kind of representation there. And I also know that from reading our text in 1 Peter, that the idea of earthly beings becoming heavenly and eternal is of great interest to them. And so I was only going to make that point here. I just want to make one other point, though. I had never realized until I had this little one, the responsibility of taking care of him, that in verse 12, it goes on to say, for what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? So we always put that in the context of Luke 15 of someone who loses their way. But in this case, if you keep reading, I think you'll find something interesting. It says, and if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. It's a different feel to this when he used this illustration. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost.
Boy, in our culture, the slaughter of...
Well, that's where I was going with this. Look, when I read this in Sunday morning in assembly, and I should have been paying attention to the sermon or whatever, but I got sidetracked about something else. And all of a sudden, I was overwhelmed. I actually got tears in my eyes because it hit me how powerful a moment this was. And I thought, you know, why have I never seen this before, as in this act of this little child of stepping in the gap, God using you so he wouldn't wander off. Not that he sinned or did anything wrong. He just, little sheep wander off and we go get them. And so when I thought we go get them, God arranges circumstances and raises up people to fill in that gap there.
Because we don't want to lose one.
No, we don't want to lose one. And so I get it. We make the point about the transformation and change, and we're working on that too. But with these little ones, there is a interest of the angels and a love from God that he don't want to lose any of them. And I think we should, if we adapted that in our culture. And so the power of this, going back to 1 Peter, is that he compares this whole transformation process to a new birth. And he compares us like little children. You grow up. And there's something really powerful about that in this.
And even let's take another break. Jase, even when he says even angels long to look into these things, it even sounds like almost an innocence with them as to try to figure out what's going on. Same thing with like a child. You know what I'm saying? It's like they just don't know, but they're really curious as to what's going on.
I'd never noticed that passage before.
I hadn't either. I had thought about, just like you, I immediately made the leap to the idea about you left on purpose, but it's not really, that's not the point he was making.
I looked up commentaries and all on it, but nobody else is teaching that either. But I thought it seems to imply that he's just talking about a little innocent child wandering off.
Yeah, that something happened to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, so let's, in 1 Peter 1, I want to read this text so we can start breaking it down some. In verse 13, anytime we always make note when you see a therefore is when we're making the transition. So therefore, so we've laid out this, Peter lays out this really powerful beginning point about what salvation looks like. So now he's going to do a therefore, which means, okay, so you got this, now what? Therefore, prepare your minds for action. So now that you know something, we're going to do something. Be self-controlled, set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, to your reference, Jase, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, Be holy because I am holy. And that's a quote from Leviticus, several places in Leviticus. Since you call on the Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God. So now we're going to talk about sort of the results that happen from this salvation that we first talked about with the new birth and the living hope and all the things from there. So,
well, and he is going to reference that in 23. He's going to go back to the you've been born again, not a perishable seed. And you were right. You see why I went to Matthew 18, because of the obedient children point. But in all, just like Peter does with a lot of what Paul does when they write these things, it's all about what God has done, and then it's therefore. There was no assertions in the first 12 verses.
Which really is the point, right, Jase? When you say, because you look at this, and if you didn't read the first part of that, and you just came to this verse and said, "Be holy because I am holy," you'd say,
"You're like, I'm out.
I'm out. How could I be holy?"
Because you look at that task and you're like, I mean, how's that even possible? And two, I think it's going back to the conversation about even how we interpret the Bible and thinking that somehow, because here's the dilemma. Anytime you start talking about being holy or doing good works and all that stuff, if you came out of legalism and you're in grace now, then anytime you hear that kind of language, like, wait, I thought it's not about what we do, right? But I think that what Peter does here is he explains kind of that tension in chapter 2 when he says, therefore, putting aside all malice, that's something you do, right? You intentionally do this, and all deceit and all hypocrisy and all envy and all slander. In other words, like, don't do bad things, put that away, and then do these things. Like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word. In other words, read your Bible. But it's not just read your Bible. He gives us the reason why. And he doesn't say so that you may earn favor with me, or that you may prove your loyalty to me, or that you may gain favor in my sight by doing what you're supposed to do. This is what this is the reason that he gives us the motivation, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. I think that right there alone is one of the most difficult things for us to understand, that the number one, that the Lord is kind, and that when we participate in the things that he tells us to do, like read our Bible, and we start craving the word like a newborn baby craves milk, we do it so that we can see the goodness of God, because that's why we don't follow him. When we don't, we just think he's not good. We think, I know you say do this, but I think this other thing is going to be more fulfilling. And God's like, no, it's not. I'm telling you, everything that I've revealed to you is revealed to you to lead you to life. And it's why I think guys like Jonathan Edwards were so provocative, but also so big in their day, instituting revival, because they honed in on this message. Or like someone today would be like John Piper, who has a website called Desiring God. And the entire premise of it is he calls it Christian hedonism. And he says that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. So it's reaching down to the level of not just doing the right thing, it's wanting and desiring the right thing. How can my desires be changed? And here's the way. You crave the word like a newborn baby craves milk.
Right. But I will interject that, so in 1 Peter 1:23, when it says, for you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and enduring, same word is used in John 1:1, the Logos of God, because I looked it up. And I think we tend to, this becomes difficult when you think I got to obey the whole Bible. Now, there's a different word that he uses next when it says 25, but the word of the Lord stands forever, and this is the word that was preached to you, because when it's talking about the spoken, when them speaking it, it's a different word.
Right,
yeah. it when you're speaking it. But I mean, I keep going back to, when we were in school, Al, and I got so much trouble. I've used this for an example. They had this little mantra, because every school has a mantra, preach the word. And they had a picture of the Bible. And so for one of my sermons, I said, you need to change that to a human on a cross, because you're missing that. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
I got in trouble about that.
And let me just clarify. We're not negating or we're not diminishing the power or the authority of God's written word. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that the written word that is inspired by the Holy Spirit, that is inerrant, it points to and explains who God is. I mean, so if you miss that, and you start to read the scriptures, to Jase's point earlier from the passage in Matthew, and you can study the scriptures diligently, and by them you can think you're saved and not be saved, because you're not saved by the scriptures. You're saved by Jesus. You're saved by his blood. This points us to him. And so it's hard to explain this, because anytime you get into this discussion, the fear is that someone's going to listen and say, "Oh, you guys don't believe that the Bible's inspired," or they're diminishing the Bible, and not at all. We're elevating the Bible because it points us to who the sovereign King is.
Exactly. And I'm glad you made that point. I feel like we have to make it every time we make this point. But the reason it's so important is because if you're going around trying to follow everything in the Bible to the letter and trying to understand everything in the Bible in absolute 100% unity, which a lot of religious groups demand.
Yeah. You're never going to.
Well, you're setting. You've missed the whole purpose of what we're here for, and God using us.
You missed the whole point. Let's take our last break.
It might be worth inviting. I mean, think about this. Just if you are 100% correct on everything that you have read in the Bible, we would like to know who you are. I mean, who is that person? Who is that?
Most people would say, no, I don't. But then they would argue about every point, thinking they were right.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a humility and attention that we hold on a lot of these things, and I've tried to rest in that space.
Well, let me give you an example
of holding tension
from where we're at. I mean, because I think there's some really difficult things to wrap your head around in what Al read. I mean, one is this idea that it says, since you call on a Father who judges each man's work. And what I was going to say is, to go in the vein of what we're talking about, I've noticed most religious groups take one of those titles over the other. So like, I've been in churches where they're focused on God as a judge, and it seems a little conservative, laid back, kind of rule-oriented. Then you go to another group who focuses on God being our Father, and they're calling him, Abba Father and Daddy, and they'll pray. And where the people who are focusing on the judgment aspect, they feel like they're being irreverent because they're making it, they're like, I mean, you hear that guy, he called him Father's dad, But I think what's interesting here is the fact that Peter has that sentence with both of those qualities in it is what's awesome about God. He is our Father, and he is a judge. So we just tend to go to all extremes, and which is how we have so many differences in the religious world. Instead of just saying, okay, if you go with the illustration that is the theme of 1 Peter, he has to be viewed as our Father because we're newborn, so we're obedient children. So you can understand that God he's just. There is a judgment that is going to happen, then that is happening, but it's not unlike something we can relate to, even with a respect for our own fathers when we were kids.
Right.
Yeah, it's like the old question, is God judge or is God Father? And the answer is yes. Is God love or is God wrath? Yes. Mm-hmm. Is God justice or mercy? Yes. I think that's the thing about these attributes. I would argue that God does have maybe, I don't know what the term would be, like primary attributes that are there, like But and then there's some that are contingent
character.
upon creation.
His character, I would say, is like, well, he's just, he's loving. But the reason he wants you to be holy is because he is holy. The reason he wants you to be, so it's not like he's coming up with things you should do just because he, is mean or, or doesn't want me to have any fun. No, he's holy. So we're going to be holy. Now, he made us holy in what he did. But I do think that's important because if you look at it from that vein, you realize that he knows what's best. And not only does he know what's best, he's done what's best for us. And it's not, there's a reason for his character being that way. So it's not like you're following the law because, well, it's just the law and I don't want to have any consequence. No, this is the right thing to do because we trust his righteousness and his justice and his love.
Right. Because of who
he knows the pathway to life because he is life. Yeah. And I think that's why he can say, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness because they'll be filled up. And I think we're looking to be filled, and we're trying it with unrighteousness, and that hasn't worked out for anybody. And I feel confident challenging anybody. How's it worked out for you? But he says if you hunger and thirst, kind of that same phraseology that he uses about craving the word like an infant craves pure milk. Like when you hunger for that, when you hunger for God, you'll actually be filled. Yeah. And I think that's the big transformation that he's offering in the Spirit is that we can experience that fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5. And when you taste that, you taste and see that the Lord is good, going back to the psalmist. And when you taste and see that the Lord is good, you're like, man, I want more of that. And so you quit craving, the Popeyes biscuits that I mentioned earlier. You start craving God. You start craving good stuff. You start craving who he is. And the more that you crave him, the less that you crave sin. And that's the transformation. That's why someone who's been walking in the Spirit, I didn't say a Christian, who's been walking in the Spirit for 20 years is not going to crave the same thing that who maybe got saved at the foot of the cross and is only 20 feet from the cross because he hasn't really been moved past that. Yeah. Like that guy's still going to be, he can be a Christian for 40 years, but if I'm still hung up at the cross and I haven't been sanctified and been transformed, I'm still going back to that place where I got justified. Man, I want more. There's more. There's transformation that's promised in Scripture to the degree that we submit to the Spirit.
Zach, I want to hear you correctly. Are you saying that eating Popeyes biscuits is sinful?
He keeps bringing up the Popeyes biscuit. What he don't know is, look, if he was a true legalist, I would offer this. I would offer this because we could make you feel better about eating the two biscuits. Yeah. Because you know what we ate before this podcast? I ate.
What's that?
3/4.
I'd say 5/6. 5/6 of a large meat lover's pizza.
Johnny's pizza.
It just look. I almost had and I did it while driving down.
It was a pro move because Jase pulled in behind me and said, because I ordered the pizzas to eat before the podcast. Yeah. Jase said, "I'm gonna get mine right out of the oven."
I followed Al instead of coming down here in the 20 minutes of it getting cold. I followed him to the pizza place, got mine, and was as I'm driving, people going around me, cheese all in the beard.
Oh, that's funny.
So I put my life at
Well,
risk.
I didn't tell you the rest of it, but I didn't confess to y'all either that I did eat about 4 pieces of fried chicken as well.
Oh, I knew.
So it wasn't just
nobody gets just biscuits from Popeyes.
A wise man once told me, you never want to reach a certain age and say to yourself, I should have eaten that biscuit. That was Phil, also in a duck blind, giving words of wisdom. Before we go to overtime, I just want to give one illustration, and we can talk about this. I think when you're viewing the characteristics of God, if we're made in the image of God, if you think about it, of buying a new vehicle or having a vehicle of any kind, whoever designed that, they designed it for, because you think, well, I bought this, so it's mine. Now I can do anything I want to. Well, wait a minute here. If you don't do what was intended for the vehicle, there's an owner's manual there, and there are rules. I mean, I was right on the line trying to eat a pizza going down, but I mean, what my point is, if you drive it into a wall, does that mean that the people that made the truck or somehow put you in a situation? No, you didn't do what it was designed to do. If you put water in it instead of gas, guess what? Don't blame anybody but yourself. And so I think when you view the characteristics of God and how that's going to come into your life, he is who he is. So at some point, if we're going to live forever with him, we had to become him.
Yeah. Which is exactly the point I want to make in overtime, which we'll talk about more, the work of the Godhead, which I think Peter does a really interesting thing in this text, and I want to talk about that in the overtime. So we'll see you there. If you want to follow us over, it's blazetv.com/unashamed, so where you sign up to get our overtime as well as everything else that Blaze has to offer. So we'll see you next time on Unashamed.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.